Subscribe now to the Circle of Fear 1 for more chilling stories.
Official death records from Greene County, Ohio, list a man named Caesar Bowen as dying in 1888 at the documented age of 126 years. The cemetery ledger specifies his birth year as 1762 during the reign of King George Roman III, when Ohio was still unmapped wilderness. But here's what makes historians uncomfortable. 7 different notarized affidavits from prominent citizens swore to knowing Caesar since their own childhoods, each confirming he appeared ancient even then. The county coroner who examined his body noted dental wear patterns and bone density inconsistent with any living person I have observed, yet refused to dispute the age claim. For over a century, this case has been quietly dismissed by academics, filed away in archives too disturbing to fully examine. What they found in Caesar's cabin after his death, a collection of 63 journals written in 3 distinct handwriting styles, all apparently his own, suggests something far more unsettling than simple longevity. Before we continue with the story of Caesar Bowen and the impossible span of his existence, if you're watching from Ohio or anywhere in the United States, let us know in the comments where you're from. Subscribe to the Circle of Fear. Hit that notification bell because stories like Caesar's deserve to be remembered. Now let me take you back to where this mystery truly begins. The question of how one man could witness the birth of a nation, the rise and fall of slavery, and the dawn of the industrial age requires us to first understand the world he claimed to have been born into. Greene County, Ohio in the 1880s was a place of modest prosperity, rolling farmland punctuated by small towns where everyone knew their neighbor's business or thought they did. Xenia, the county seat, had rebuilt itself after a devastating tornado in 1874, and the railroad had brought new commerce and new faces. It was a community proud of its abolitionist heritage, a place where underground railroad routes were spoken of with reverence, where the memory of the war still shaped daily life. Caesar Bowen lived 2 miles outside Xenia proper in a cabin that locals agreed had stood for at least 60 years, possibly longer. The structure itself seemed to bend with age, its hand-hewn logs darkened to near black, its stone chimney leaning at an angle that should have been impossible. Cedar shakes on the roof were held down with river stones, a construction technique that hadn't been used locally since the 1810s. The old man was a familiar sight in town, walking with a gnarled hickory cane that he claimed to have cut himself in 1799. He stood barely 5 feet tall, his frame so bent with age that children sometimes mistook him for a pile of rags until he moved. His skin had the texture of old leather left too long in the sun, creased with lines so deep they seemed to map territories of suffering. His eyes, though, everyone who met Caesar commented on his eyes. They were unnervingly clear, the pale brown of creek water over sand, and they focused on you with an intensity that made grown men shift their weight and look away. He made his living doing small repairs, mending harnesses and tools with a skill that suggested decades of practice. His hands twisted with what people assumed was arthritis, nevertheless moved with surprising precision when he worked. He spoke rarely, his voice a dry whisper that forced people to lean close to hear. And when he did speak, his language carried peculiar archaisms, thee and thou, phrases that belonged to a previous century. The town physician, Dr. Harold Sutton, had been trying to examine Caesar properly for 3 years. The man's vitals are impossible, he told his wife over dinner in 1887. His pulse is barely 40 beats per minute. His respiratory rate would suggest deep sleep, yet he's fully conscious. I've read every medical text available, and I can find no precedent. "Perhaps he's simply very healthy for his age," Mrs. Sutton suggested. "That's just it, Margaret. If the records are accurate, if he truly is 125 years old, then his age should have killed him decades ago. The oldest verified person I've read of lived to 108. Caesar claims to have exceeded that by nearly 20 years. The records Dr. Sutton referred to were housed in the Greene County Courthouse, preserved through multiple filing systems. A manumission document dated July 4, 1826, officially freed Caesar, Negro man, aged approximately 64 years, from the service of one Jeremiah Hawthorne of Virginia. The same document noted that Caesar had been in Hawthorne's family since 1784, when Jeremiah's father purchased him as an adult Negro of significant years. Working backward, even the most conservative estimates placed Caesar's birth in the early 1760s. But it was Caesar's own testimony given to various people over the years, and meticulously recorded by local historians, that painted an even more extraordinary picture. He claimed to remember the Stamp Act riots, the growing tensions that would lead to revolution. He said he'd been a boy when Pontiac's rebellion swept through the territories, when the French still held influence in the Ohio Valley. He spoke of winters so cold that trees exploded from the frost of summers when the sun turned red from forest fires that burned for months. "I was born on a tobacco farm in Tidewater, Virginia," he told a reporter from the Xenia Gazette in 1885. One of the few extensive interviews he ever gave. "My mother was 16. She died that same year. Fever took her. My father I never knew. He was sold away before I could walk. The master's name was Josiah Warren, and he worked 200 acres with 23 souls. I was the smallest, the weakest. They didn't think I'd live past my first winter." The reporter, a young man named Thomas Fletcher, had been sent to write a human interest piece about the oldest resident in the county. He expected a brief conversation, perhaps some colorful tales, something to fill half a column on a slow news day. Instead, he spent 4 hours in Caesar's cabin filling page after page of his notebook, his hand cramping from the speed of his writing. "What do you remember most clearly from your childhood?" Fletcher asked. Caesar was quiet for so long that Fletcher thought he might have fallen asleep. The old man sat in a chair by the empty fireplace. It was July, sweltering hot, but the cabin remained cool in a way that seemed unnatural. Finally Caesar spoke, the smell of tobacco leaves drying in the barn, the way the light came through the cracks in the walls, all striped and golden. The sound of singing in the quarters at night, old songs from Africa that none of us knew the meanings to anymore. But we sang them anyway because our mothers had sung them, and their mothers before them. And I remember being hungry, always hungry. They fed us enough to work, but never enough to feel full. You must have seen tremendous changes in your lifetime," Fletcher prompted. "The revolution, the formation of the country, the expansion west. I saw empires fall and rise," Caesar said, his voice taking on a strange, distant quality. "I saw slavery spread like a sickness across this land, and I saw it finally die. I watched cities burn. I witnessed things that would break your mind if I described them properly. But the strangest thing, Mr. Fletcher, the thing that keeps me awake in whatever hours I still sleep, is that I remember all of it. Every face, every voice, every moment of suffering and brief joy, they accumulate like stones in your chest, pressing down, making each breath an effort." Fletcher published his article, but the editor cut most of Caesar's more provocative statements, deemed them too dark for the family-oriented paper. The full interview, however, remained in Fletcher's personal files, and would later become crucial evidence. In the spring of 1887, Caesar began to weaken noticeably. He appeared in town less frequently, and when he did, he moved with even greater difficulty. Dr. Sutton made house calls despite Caesar's protestations that no physician has ever done me good, and I suspect none ever will. On October 12, 1887, Caesar Bowen stopped speaking. Not gradually, abruptly, in the middle of a conversation with his neighbor, Samuel Pritchard, a farmer who occasionally brought Caesar food and checked on his welfare. Pritchard would later testify to authorities about that day, his statement preserved in county records. I arrived at Caesar's cabin around 2 in the afternoon, found him sitting in his chair as usual, staring at nothing. I greeted him, asked how he was feeling. He turned to look at me, opened his mouth as if to respond. And then his expression changed. I can't rightly describe it, sir, but it was as if he suddenly remembered something terrible or realized something he'd been avoiding. His eyes went wide, his mouth stayed open, but no sound came out. I thought he was having an apoplexy, so I rushed forward to help him, but he pushed me away with surprising strength and pointed to the door. His meaning was clear. He wanted me to leave. Pritchard left disturbed and returned the next morning with Dr. Sutton. They found Caesar in the same chair in what appeared to be the same position. He was alive, responsive to physical stimuli, but completely mute. His eyes followed them as they moved around the cabin, but he made no sound, no attempt to communicate. Dr. Sutton examined him thoroughly and found nothing physically wrong with his throat or mouth. It's as if he's chosen not to speak, the doctor wrote in his notes. But why would a man who has survived for so long suddenly decide to lock himself in silence? Over the following weeks, Caesar's condition deteriorated in strange ways. He continued to eat the food that neighbors brought mechanically without apparent awareness of taste or texture. He never left his chair near the fireplace. Most unsettling, he began to exhibit what Dr. Sutton termed episodes of temporal confusion. I visited him on a Tuesday afternoon, Dr. Sutton recorded, and found him staring at the wall with such intensity that I followed his gaze, expecting to see something there. There was nothing, only the old logs and mortar. I spoke his name several times before he acknowledged me, and when he turned his head, his expression was one of such profound terror that I instinctively stepped back. Then, as quickly as it appeared, the expression vanished, replaced by his usual distant calm. Local children, always drawn to the mysterious and macabre, began to whisper stories about the old man who'd stopped talking. They said that if you walked past his cabin at night, you could see him through the window, his lips moving silently, as if holding a conversation with invisible companions. They said his shadow fell wrong, pointing in directions that didn't match the light source. They said he was counting down to something, though how they'd arrived at this conclusion no one could explain. Martha Hewitt, a widow who lived closest to Caesar's property, told her prayer circle that she'd heard singing coming from his cabin one night. Not the old man's voice, but multiple voices in harmony, singing in a language she didn't recognize. When she worked up the courage to investigate, the next morning Caesar was alone, and there was no sign that anyone else had been present. Then, on a freezing night in January 1888, Samuel Pritchard was awakened by the sound of someone pounding on his door. He opened it to find Caesar Bowen standing in the snow, barefoot, dressed only in his night shirt, his breath coming in harsh gasps. Before Pritchard could speak, Caesar collapsed. They carried him back to his cabin. Dr. Sutton was summoned, and for 3 days Caesar burned with a fever that should have killed him. He thrashed in his bed, calling out names in his delirium, names that meant nothing to anyone present. Abigail, Jonas, Scipio, Delilah, Samuel, each name followed by pleas or apologies or fragments of conversation. "Tell them I tried," he said once clearly, his eyes open, but focused on something beyond the ceiling. Tell them it was never supposed to be this long. On the fourth day, the fever broke. Caesar opened his eyes, looked directly at Dr. Sutton, and spoke his first words in 3 months. "How many years has it been? Since what?" Dr. Sutton asked gently. "Since I was young," Caesar whispered. Then he closed his eyes and fell into a sleep so deep that the doctor had to place a mirror under his nose repeatedly to confirm he was still breathing. Caesar never fully recovered from that illness, but he did begin speaking again sporadically in brief sentences that often seemed disconnected from immediate reality. Dr. Sutton started keeping detailed notes of everything Caesar said, hoping to understand the source of what he termed the patient's episodic clarity and confusion. It was during one of these visits in early February 1888 that Caesar said something that changed the trajectory of Dr. Sutton's investigation. "I should have died with the others. On the crossing, that's when it should have ended." "What crossing?" Dr. Sutton asked, though he suspected he knew. "The middle passage," Caesar said, his voice barely audible. "But I was born here, born in Virginia. I never made that crossing, so why do I remember it? Why do I remember the hold of the ship, the smell of sickness and death, the chains cutting into my ankles? Why do I remember Africa, Dr. Sutton? I've never been to Africa." The doctor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter cold seeping through the cabin walls. "Perhaps these are stories you were told, memories passed down." "No." Caesar's eyes, those unnervingly clear eyes, fixed on him with sudden intensity. "These are my memories, or someone's memories. I carry them like I carry my own. I remember things that happened before I was born. I remember dying, Dr. Sutton, multiple times in different ways, and yet here I am, still breathing, still remembering, accumulating years and memories that don't belong to me." Dr. Sutton should have dismissed this as fever-induced delusion. Instead, he found himself asking, "What do you think is happening to you?" "I think," Caesar said slowly, "that I am carrying the weight of more than one life. I think somehow, in ways I cannot explain, the memories and years of others have been added to my own. I think I have lived long enough to know that God's justice sometimes manifests in ways we cannot comprehend, and I think I am both blessed and cursed to bear witness." Over the following weeks, Dr. Sutton returned, frequently drawn by a compulsion he couldn't fully explain. Caesar spoke more during this period than he had in years, and always his words circled back to the same themes: memory, time, the weight of witnessing. He described in vivid detail life on 3 different Virginia plantations. The records showed he'd only ever been owned by 2 families. He recounted events from the Revolutionary War with the specificity of someone who'd been present despite being a child at the time. He spoke about the burning of Washington in 1814 as if he'd witnessed it personally, describing the flame consuming the Capitol with a detail that matched historical accounts. "I was in the field when I heard," he said. "August heat, tobacco plants tall enough to hide a man. The overseer came running, shouting that the British had taken the Capitol, that they'd burned it to the ground. I remember thinking, this is what empires do to each other. They destroy the symbols of power, but they forget that the real power lies in the people who plant the tobacco, who build the buildings, who create the wealth that makes the symbols possible in the first place." Dr. Sutton recorded all of this faithfully, filling journal after journal with Caesar's testimony. He began to research the old man's claims, cross-referencing them with historical records, trying to find inconsistencies that would explain the impossible accuracy of his recollections. He found none. Everything Caesar described that could be verified matched historical facts. More disturbing, Caesar occasionally mentioned events that weren't in the popular histories, small incidents, personal details that Dr. of a sudden could only confirm by tracking down obscure documents or interviewing elderly residents who might remember family stories. I watched a man named Thomas Garrett help over 2,000 slaves escape to freedom, Caesar said one afternoon. This was in Delaware years ago. I never met him personally, but I knew people who did. He was prosecuted, fined everything he owned, and he just kept doing it. The judge told him he hoped the fine would teach him a lesson. And Garrett said, "Judge, thee hasn't left me $1, but I wish to say to thee and to all in this courtroom that if anyone knows of a fugitive who wants a shelter and a friend, send him to Thomas Garrett and he will befriend him. Do you know what courage like that costs, doctor? True courage, not the kind sung about in ballads, but the kind that makes you a criminal in service of justice." Dr. Sutton did know of Thomas Garrett. He was a famous abolitionist who had indeed helped thousands escape. But how Caesar knew such specific details about his trial was a mystery. The old man claimed never to have left Ohio since his arrival in 1826. As winter turned to early spring, Caesar's physical condition continued to decline, but his mind seemed to sharpen. He began asking Dr. Sutton to bring him specific items from town: newspapers, almanacs, maps. He studied these with fierce concentration as if searching for something. "What are you looking for?" Dr. Sutton finally asked. "I'm trying to determine when," Caesar said. "I felt it approaching for months now. Time is finally catching up to me. All those borrowed years, all those memories that don't belong to me, they're coming due. I need to know when it will happen so I can prepare." "Prepare for what?" "For settling the account," Caesar said simply, "for returning what was never truly mine." The breakthrough came in March 1888, when Thomas Fletcher, the reporter who had interviewed Caesar 3 years earlier, returned to Xenia. He'd been working for a Cincinnati newspaper, but had never forgotten the old man's story. When he heard through mutual acquaintances that Caesar was declining, he made the journey to see him one last time. Fletcher arrived with something unexpected: a collection of letters he'd received over the years from readers who'd seen his original article about Caesar. Most were the usual responses to human interest stories, reminiscences from elderly readers about their own long-lived relatives, theories about diet and exercise, religious interpretations about divine will, but 3 letters were different. The first was from a woman named Victoria Ashford in Richmond, Virginia. She wrote that her grandfather, before his death in 1879, had spoken of a slave named Caesar who'd worked on her family's plantation in the 1780s and 90s. According to her grandfather's stories, Caesar had been remarkable for his intelligence and his uncanny ability to predict weather patterns and agricultural yields. "My grandfather said that Caesar seemed to possess knowledge that exceeded his station." She wrote he spoke as if he'd read books, though my grandfather swore no slave on their property had ever been taught to read. When the slave was sold away in 1795, my grandfather said he felt relieved, as if a presence that didn't quite fit the natural order had been removed. The second letter came from a Methodist minister in Delaware named Reverend Josiah Crothers. He described visiting a sick parishioner in 1850 who in his delirium kept calling for someone named Caesar. The man was 90 years old, the Reverend wrote, and in his fever he kept repeating that he needed to confess to Caesar and make it right before the judgment. When I asked his daughter about this Caesar, she told me that her father had owned slaves in his youth in Virginia, and that one named Caesar had run away in 1808. She said her father had always believed Caesar had drowned trying to cross the Toke, but that he'd been haunted by guilt, believing he'd driven the man to desperate measures through cruel treatment. The third letter was the most disturbing. It came from a historian in Pennsylvania named Dr. Edmund Thorne, who had been researching Quaker involvement in the Underground Railroad. I came across notarized testimony from 1823, he wrote, given by a conductor named Ruth Ames, who described helping a fugitive named Caesar cross from Maryland into Pennsylvania. What struck me was her description of the man. She said he appeared ancient, that his hands shook with palsy, and that he spoke with such refined diction that she initially doubted he was truly a runaway slave. Most remarkably, she wrote that when she asked him his age, he told her he was 61 years, though I feel as if I've lived 3 lifetimes. Miss Ames noted that in her 2 decades of helping fugitives, she'd never met anyone quite like him. Fletcher spread these letters on the table in Caesar's cabin. The old man looked at them for a long moment, then reached out with a trembling hand to touch the paper. I remember Victoria's grandfather. He said quietly, Thomas Ashford. He was 14 years old when I arrived at his father's plantation. Curious boy, always asking questions. He wanted to understand how I knew when frost would come early, how I could tell if the tobacco crop would be strong or weak. I told him I'd learned to read the signs, animal behavior, cloud formations, the feel of the air, but the truth was more complicated. I knew because I remembered. I'd seen 60 growing seasons by then, though my body had only seen perhaps 25. The memories accumulated faster than the years. He pointed to the second letter, Reverend Crothers's parishioner. That would have been Benjamin Morton. I ran from his farm in 1808, crossed the Toke on a stolen boat, nearly drowned when it capsized in the current. I didn't drown, obviously, though perhaps that would have been a mercy. Morton was a cruel man who found pleasure in others' suffering. I don't regret leaving him to his guilt, and Ruth Ames, Fletcher asked, his pencil flying across his notebook. A saint, Caesar said with feeling. She risked everything to help people she'd never met, expected nothing in return. She fed me, gave me clothes, provided directions to the next safe house. She did ask me my age, and I told her the truth as I understood it then. 61 years of memories, though my body he trailed off, looking at his gin-lead hands. My body has never matched my years. It ages, yes, but not at the rate it should. It's as if time passes through me differently than it does for others. Dr. Sutton, who had been present for this conversation, leaned forward. Caesar, I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to be as honest as you can be. Do you believe you have actually lived for 126 years? Not metaphorically, not carrying the memories of others, but actually physically existed for that span of time? Caesar was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant. Finally he said, I believe I have existed for 126 years. Whether I have lived them is a different question. To live is to experience joy, growth, connection. I have experienced mostly suffering, with brief moments of something else. As for how it's possible, he shook his head slowly. I have theories, Doctor, sudden but no certainty. What I know is this. I have memories that span over a century. I have been documented in records across multiple states over many decades, and I have continued breathing long past when any normal man should have returned to dust. What are your theories? Fletcher asked eagerly. Caesar's expression darkened. There was a woman, he said slowly, when I was young, very young, perhaps 10 years old. She was old even then, ancient, brought over on the slave ships from Africa. She spoke little English, but she knew things, plants, herbs, rhythms of nature that seemed almost mystical to a child. She took an interest in me because I was small, weak, unlikely to survive. One night she performed some kind of ritual. I don't remember the details clearly. I've wondered if that's intentional, if my mind refuses to retain them, but I remember her words. You will carry the weight of your people. You will remember what should be forgotten. You will witness the suffering and the eventual freedom, and you will bear testimony. A curse, Doctor Sutton Asked or a blessing, Caesar replied, depending on how you measure such things. She died 3 days later, and I began to notice differences. I healed from injuries that should have killed me. I survived diseases that decimated entire slave quarters, and I started remembering things I shouldn't have been able to remember, events I never witnessed, people I never met. But somehow their experiences became part of my memory as if I'd absorbed them. Fletcher's hand had stopped moving. You're suggesting that this woman, through some African practice, made you immortal, not immortal. Caesar corrected. I age. I feel pain. I grow weaker. But the process is extended, drawn out far beyond its natural span. And the memories I believe I've somehow absorbed the experiences of others. Other slaves I encountered whose suffering and stories became part of my own recall. It's as if I became a living archive carrying the testimonies of people who otherwise would have left no record. Dr. Sutton and Fletcher exchanged glances. The rational part of both men wanted to dismiss this as the fantasy of a senile old man, but the evidence before them, the letters, the historical records, the impossible longevity suggested something beyond normal experience. The journals, Dr. Sutton said suddenly. Samuel Pritchard mentioned seeing journals in your cabin, 63 of them written in different hands. 3 hands, Caesar said. Mine as it was 50 years ago, mine as it was 20 years ago, and mine as it is now. The handwriting changes as age claims my fingers, but the words remain constant. I've been documenting everything, every memory, every story, every witness I've carried, because someday when this is finally over, someone needs to know. Someone needs to remember that we were here, that we suffered, that we survived, and that our stories matter. The existence of the journals transformed Dr. Sutton and Fletcher's investigation from curious inquiry into urgent documentation. Caesar, sensing perhaps that his time was growing short, agreed to let them examine the volumes. The journals were unlike anything either man had ever seen. They were written on every conceivable type of paper, rough pulp, fine vellum, the backs of discarded documents, even bark from birch trees. Some volumes were bound in leather, others stitched together with plant fibers. Earliest entries were dated 1795. The handwriting in those first journals was elegant, educated, completely at odds with what anyone would expect from a slave who claimed to have no formal education. Dr. Sutton, who had some experience with historical documents, noted that the style matched the penmanship taught in the late 18th century. I taught myself, Caesar explained when questioned, stole a primer from the master's son, practiced in secret. It took 3 years before I could form proper letters, worth every risk though. Once you can read and write, they can take everything else from you. But they can't take your thoughts. The content of the journals was even more extraordinary than the handwriting. Caesar had documented not just his own experiences, but those of dozens of other slaves. Each entry was dated and included the name of the person whose story he was recording. June 12, 1803, spoke today with Lydia, age approximately 40, who were separated from her 3 children when her master sold them to a sugar plantation in Louisiana. She described the morning they were taken, how the youngest clung to her skirts, how the middle child remained silent with shock, how the oldest tried to run and was caught and beaten. Lydia has not seen them in 6 years. She works now in the master's house, serving food to the family that destroyed hers, and she does so with grace because to do otherwise would mean punishment. I will carry this story forward so that someone someday knows that Lydia existed, that she loved, that she suffered, and that she endured. Page after page contained similar entries. Some described violence in careful clinical terms that somehow made it more horrifying than graphic detail would have. Others focused on small moments of resistance or kindness. Many documented the separation of families, the heartbreak of watching children sold away. Why did you take on this burden? Fletcher asked, his throat tight as he read. Because no one else could, Caesar said. Slaves couldn't write their own stories. Most couldn't read or write at all, and those who could would be punished severely if discovered. White people wouldn't document these experiences truthfully if they acknowledged them at all. I realized that I had been given a terrible gift, the time to witness. The ability to record and the necessity to remember. How could I not use it? But it was the later journals from the 1840s onward that truly disturbed Dr. Sutton. The handwriting had deteriorated somewhat, grown shakier, but the content had changed in another way. Caesar began to describe memories that he explicitly stated were not his own experiences, but rather recollections that had somehow entered his mind. November 3rd, 1847, I remember a ship. I have never been on a ship, yet I remember this one with absolute clarity. The hold is dark, airless, packed with bodies chained so tightly that we cannot move. I say we, though this is not my memory. It belongs to someone else, someone whose name I never learned. The smell is beyond description. Human waste, vomit, rotting flesh. Fear itself has a smell in that hold. People die around me, and their bodies remain chained to the living for days before the sailors remove them. I remember the sound of people praying in languages I don't understand. Remember the sensation of the ship rolling on waves. Remember thinking that death would be a mercy. This is not my memory, yet I carry it now. How many others carry memories they did not earn? How many of us hold the suffering of our ancestors in our bodies, in our dreams, in the way we move through the world? Dr. Sutton looked up from reading this entry to find Caesar watching him with those unsettling clear eyes. You think I'm insane? The old man said flatly. I think, Dr. Sutton said carefully, that you have experienced something beyond normal human existence. Whether that's through some mechanism we don't understand, or through a psychological process of incorporating others' stories so deeply that they feel like memories. I cannot say, but I do know that you believe these experiences are real, and I know that you have lived far longer than should be possible. It's more than belief, Caesar said with sudden intensity. I can describe the face of the woman who nursed me through fever when I was 5 years old, though my mother was already dead. I can tell you the exact pattern of scars on the back of a man named Joshua, whom I met once briefly in 1812, and whose beating I somehow remember as if I'd felt it myself. I carry the weight of hundreds of lives, Doctor, their joys, their sorrows, their moments of grace, and their years of torment. And now, as I approach the end, I feel them gathering, all those memories, all those people pressing close, waiting. Waiting for what? Fletcher asked. For the settling, Caesar said, for the final accounting. I told you before that time is catching up to me. What I didn't tell you is that I can feel all those borrowed years pulling back like a debt being called in. Every day I feel heavier, more tired. It's not just physical aging. It's as if every year I've lived beyond my natural span is now demanding its due all at once. Just when we thought we'd uncovered the full scope of Caesar's impossible existence, something happened that would force everyone to reconsider everything they thought they knew. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content. And don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. What followed in the final months of Caesar's life would challenge the boundaries between the possible and impossible, between the rational and the inexplicable. In late April 1888, Caesar's cabin became an informal research station. Dr. Sutton visited daily, sometimes twice a day. Fletcher stayed in town conducting interviews and cross-referencing Caesar's claims. Together they had documented dozens of historical verifications, events Caesar described that matched records, people he claimed to have met whose existence could be confirmed, details about places and times that proved accurate when investigated. But verifying historical accuracy wasn't the same as explaining impossible longevity. Martha Hewitt, the neighboring widow, began assisting with Caesar's care. She brought meals, cleaned the cabin, and sat with him when the two men were occupied elsewhere. It was she who first noticed the physical changes that began manifesting in early May. His skin, she told Dr. Sutton one morning, her voice trembling slightly. It's becoming thinner, almost translucent. I can see the veins beneath the pattern of bones. And his eyes, they've started changing color. They were always pale brown, but now they're turning almost gray like old glass. Dr. Sutton examined Caesar and confirmed Martha's observations. The old man's skin had indeed become papery, delicate, to the point where the slightest pressure left bruises. His eyes had taken on a clouded quality, though his vision seemed unimpaired. Most disturbing was his weight loss. Caesar had always been small, but he was now visibly shrinking, as if his very substance was being consumed from within. "How do you feel?" Dr. Sutton asked. "Hollow," Caesar whispered, "like something is being drawn out of me. Not painfully, but steadily. I can feel myself becoming less solid, less present. It's as if I'm slowly translating from flesh into something else. Memory, perhaps, or pure witness, unbound by physical form." Fletcher, who had been cataloging the journals in a corner of the cabin, looked up sharply. "You're speaking metaphorically, am I?" Caesar's gaze was distant. "I'm not certain anymore. The boundary between the physical and the remembered has been blurring for days. Sometimes I look at my hands and I'm not sure if they're my hands or hands I've remembered, belonging to someone else who once lived and suffered and worked these same fields." On May 3rd, the situation intensified dramatically. Dr. Sutton arrived at his usual morning hour to find Caesar in a state of profound distress. The old man sat rigid in his chair, his eyes wide but unfocused, his breath coming in short gasps. At first, the doctor thought he was having a cardiac episode, but Caesar's pulse, while rapid, remained steady. "What's happening, doctor?" Sutton asked urgently, taking Caesar's wrist to monitor his heartbeat. "They're here," Caesar whispered, and his voice seemed to echo strangely in the small cabin. "All of them. Every person whose story I carried, every memory I absorbed, they're all here surrounding me. And they want their time back." Dr. Sutton saw nothing unusual in the cabin. But he could not dismiss the terror in Caesar's eyes, or the way the old man's gaze tracked invisible presences moving around the room. "Tell me what you're experiencing. Describe it as precisely as you can." "I'm remembering everything at once," Caesar said, his voice strained, words tumbling over each other. "Every moment of every life I've touched. It's overwhelming. Lydia, whose children were sold away, I can feel her grief as if it's happening now. Joshua, who was beaten for learning to read. I feel the lash on my back, though I was never beaten in that way. Sarah, who poisoned herself rather than continue in bondage. I taste the bitter herbs on my tongue. Thomas, who successfully escaped and made it to Canada. I feel his joy and his survivor's guilt. They're all here, all present, all demanding acknowledgement. I can't separate my own experiences from theirs anymore. I don't know which memories belong to me and which I've borrowed. I don't know who I am beneath all these accumulated years." Dr. Sutton made detailed notes, even as a part of him recognized that he was documenting something that existed outside the framework of medical science. Caesar's pupils were dilated, his breathing erratic, but his physical signs didn't fully explain the psychological crisis he appeared to be experiencing. "Try to focus on my voice," Dr. Sutton said, employing techniques he'd learned for calming delirious patients. "Ground yourself in this moment, in this place." "But that's just it," Caesar said, and suddenly his voice changed, became higher, softer, unmistakably feminine. "This moment isn't just one moment. It's every moment I've carried. I am Caesar, but I'm also Lydia. I'm Joshua. I'm Sarah, I'm Thomas, I'm Abigail and Jonas and Scipio and Delilah and Samuel. I'm the woman who performed the ritual when I was a child, I'm the child I was, I'm the old man I've become, I'm all of them all at once, and the weight of it is crushing the boundaries that separated them. The voice shifted again mid-sentence, becoming deeper, rougher. Then it shifted again, taking on a different accent. Dr. Sutton watched in horrified fascination as Caesar seemed to cycle through different personas, each speaking for a few moments before giving way to the next. Fletcher arrived shortly after, summoned by Martha Hewitt, who had heard Caesar's voice changing and had run for help in a panic. Together, the two men watched as Caesar exhibited what Dr. Sutton could only describe as a complete fragmentation of identity. Over the next 3 days, the phenomenon intensified. Caesar cycled through what appeared to be dozens of different personas. Sometimes he spoke in dialects from various regions, the distinctive Gullah accent of the Georgia coast, the clipped tones of Maryland's eastern shore, the softer drawl of Virginia tidewater. Sometimes his voice took on different qualities entirely, higher or lower, faster or slower. He responded to different names. He described scenes from multiple perspectives, as if he'd been several different people in the same moment. I'm in the tobacco field. The sun is burning my back. I'm 12 years old, he said in a child's voice, then seamlessly shifting. I'm in the kitchen house. My hands are scarred from years of handling hot pots. I'm watching the master's children play. Another shift. I'm running through the forest at night, following the North Star. My feet are bleeding, but I can't stop. Dr. Sutton documented all of it with clinical precision, filling page after page with observations, but privately he felt he was witnessing something that exceeded medical explanation. He checked Caesar's physical condition repeatedly, temperature, pulse, respiration, pupil response, and found nothing that would explain the psychological crisis unfolding before him. On the evening of May 5th, alone in his room at the boarding house, Dr. Sutton wrote in his personal journal, I am a man of science. I was trained at one of the finest medical colleges in the country. I believe in rational explanations, in physical mechanisms that can be studied and understood. But what I'm observing in Caesar Bowen defies everything I know about human physiology and psychology. He appears to be simultaneously dying and reliving every moment of an impossibly extended life. The personality shifts are too complete, too detailed, too consistent to be simple confusion or delirium. Each voice that speaks through him carries distinct patterns of speech, distinct memories, distinct emotional tones. If I didn't have the historical documentation to support his claims, I would assume I was dealing with a case of extreme dissociative disorder. But the evidence suggests something else entirely, something that suggests consciousness and memory operate in ways we do not yet comprehend, in ways that may transcend the individual body and brain. He paused, pen hovering over the page, then added, I find myself wondering if what I'm witnessing is a death unlike any other, not the cessation of one life, but the dispersal of many lives that have been held together by a single fragile vessel. If Caesar truly has carried forward the memories and experiences of others, what happens when that vessel can no longer contain them? Do they simply dissipate, or is something else occurring here? On May 6th, Caesar had a period of unusual clarity. He woke from a fitful sleep and seemed for a few hours to be entirely himself, or at least entirely the Caesar that Dr. Sutton and Fletcher had come to know. I owe you both an apology, he said, his voice weak but steady. You've witnessed something disturbing, something that shouldn't be possible. But I need you to understand what's happening. I need you to document it because this dispersal of accumulated identity, it may be important. Tell us what you understand, Fletcher said, his pencil ready. Caesar gathered his thoughts, his eyes focusing with effort. When I was a child and that woman performed a ritual, I don't think she fully understood what she was doing. I think she was working from fragments of knowledge, practices half remembered from Africa, trying to preserve something precious in the only way she knew how. She wanted the stories to survive, the testimonies of suffering and resistance to outlast the people who experienced them, so she chose a vessel, me small and weak and unlikely to survive otherwise, and she bound those stories to me, somehow made me a repository. But how, Dr. Sutton asked. Through what mechanism? I don't know the mechanism, Caesar admitted, but I know the effect. Whenever I encountered another slave who was dying or suffering or in danger of being lost to history, something in me absorbed them, not their physical presence, but their essence, their memories, their experiences, their witness. It was as if I became a living archive, collecting testimonies that would otherwise have been erased. And with each absorption, I gained time, their remaining years added to mine, extending my life beyond its natural span. He paused, breathing heavily from the effort of speaking, but nothing can be sustained indefinitely. The human body, the human mind, they have limits. I've exceeded those limits for over a century now. Those borrowed years, those accumulated memories, they're pulling back. Each person whose story I carried, reclaiming their time, their identity, their separate existence, and as they do, I'm fragmenting. The Caesar who was born in 1762 is being stripped away layer by layer, revealing all the others I carried within me. Is there pain? Dr. Sutton asked gently. Not physical pain, Caesar said, but imagine feeling your sense of self dissolving. Imagine knowing who you are, what you've experienced, what makes you distinct as an individual, and then having all of that blur and blend with dozens, hundreds of other selves. Imagine being unable to distinguish between your mother's face and someone else's mother's face, between your own childhood and another person's childhood. That's what's happening. I'm becoming everyone I've ever carried, and in the process, I'm ceasing to be anyone at all. Fletcher looked up from his notes, his expression troubled. Is there anything we can do to help, any way to ease this process? Caesar smiled, a surprisingly gentle expression on his weathered face. You're already doing it. You're bearing witness to my witness. When I'm gone, the journals will remain, but they're just words on paper. You too have seen the reality behind the words. You've watched the cost of carrying such a burden. That matters more than you know. The clarity didn't last. By evening, Caesar had slipped back into the fragmented state, cycling through different voices and personas. But the conversation had given both Dr. Sutton and Fletcher a framework for understanding what they were observing. On May 7th, something new occurred. Caesar began speaking in languages that neither Dr. Sutton nor Fletcher recognized. The rhythms suggested West African origins, but the specific words were unknown to them. Caesar's voice took on qualities that seemed impossible for his aged throat to produce. Deep resonant tones, high keening wails, rhythmic chanting that filled the cabin with sound. Martha Hewitt, who had been preparing a meal in the corner, dropped the plate she was holding. That's not natural, she whispered. That's not a sound a human should make, Doctor. Sutton couldn't disagree, but he remained at Caesar's side, monitoring his physical condition even as the sounds continued. The old man's pulse remained steady, his breathing regular despite the vocalizations. It was as if the sounds were coming through him rather than from him. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the strange episode ceased. Caesar slumped in his chair, exhausted, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The old songs, he murmured, the ones they sang on the ships, in the fields, in the quarters at night. I've been carrying them for so long I'd forgotten they weren't mine, but they want to be sung one last time before they're released. Over the following day, Caesar would occasionally break into these songs, sometimes alone, sometimes as if part of a chorus of invisible voices. Dr. Sutton, despite his scientific training, found himself deeply moved by the sound. There was something in those melodies that spoke of profound suffering and equally profound resilience. of humanity persisting under conditions designed to crush it. On the night of May 8th, Caesar's crisis reached its peak. Thomas Fletcher, who had been staying with Dr. Sutton at the boarding house, was awakened by someone pounding on their door. It was Samuel Pritchard, who had heard screaming coming from Caesar's cabin. The three men ran through the darkness, arriving to find every lamp in the cabin lit, though none of them could recall Caesar having that many lamps. The air inside felt thick, charged with something that made the hair on their arms stand up. Caesar was standing in the middle of the cabin, though he'd been too weak to stand unassisted for weeks. His arms were spread wide, his face tilted toward the ceiling, and he was speaking rapidly in what sounded like multiple languages or dialects simultaneously. It was as if several voices were emanating from him at once, overlapping and interweaving, creating a chorus that should have been impossible from a single throat. Dr. Sutton recognized some English words, some fragments that might have been West African languages, others that defied identification. The effect was deeply unsettling, a violation of the natural order that made it difficult to remain in the room. "Should we restrain him?" Pritchard asked, his voice shaking. "Don't touch him, Doctor," Sutton said, though he wasn't sure why he knew this was important. Something in the moment suggested that Caesar needed to complete whatever process was occurring, that interruption might cause harm in ways they couldn't predict. The Polyonic speech continued for several minutes, growing in intensity, the multiple voices seeming to argue or debate with each other. Then abruptly, Caesar fell silent. The lamps flickered as if responding to the sudden cessation of sound. The thick feeling in the air began to dissipate. Caesar lowered his arms slowly, lowered his head, and looked directly at the three men watching him. His expression was calm, almost serene, completely at odds with the disturbing display they'd just witnessed. "I understand now," he said clearly in his own voice, the voice they'd come to recognize as distinctly his. "This was never about me living one impossibly long life. It was about me carrying forward the lives that were cut short, the stories that would have been forgotten. That woman, when I was a child, she didn't make me immortal, she made me a vessel. Every slave I encountered who died too young, whose story would have died with them, somehow some part of their experience was preserved in me. Their memories, their years, their witness, I became a living archive of suffering and survival. That's not scientifically possible," Dr. Sutton said, though his voice lacked conviction. After what he just witnessed, appeals to scientific possibility felt hollow. "Science doesn't yet understand consciousness or memory," Caesar replied, moving slowly back toward his chair. His movements were steadier now, as if some burden had been lifted. "How they form, where they reside, whether they can exist beyond individual bodies. You study the brain, Doctor, and you've learned impressive things about its structure and function. But can you tell me where a memory lives? Can you show me the physical location of identity, of the sense of self? Can you explain why some people remember things that never happened to them, or why certain places feel familiar though they've never been visited before?" Dr. Sutton had no answer. These were questions that had troubled philosophers and physicians for centuries, questions that remained fundamentally unresolved. Caesar settled into his chair with evident relief. "I know what I've experienced. I know that I've carried forward the testimonies of hundreds of people who deserve to be remembered, and now, finally, I can let them go. The ritual that bound them to me is complete. They've had their witness. Their testimony has been preserved in the journals, and now they can release their hold on this world. And he paused, a small smile crossing his weathered face, "I can finally rest. The debt is settled," he continued softly. "The weight is lifting. I can feel all those borrowed years releasing their hold. For the first time in longer than I can remember, I feel light. It's extraordinary. I had forgotten what it felt like to be simply myself, to have memories that are only my own, to not carry the accumulated grief and joy and suffering of so many others. What does that mean, Fletcher asked, though he suspected he knew. In practical terms, what happens now? It means, Caesar said gently, that it's finally time for me to die. The borrowed years are returning to wherever such things return. The vessel has served its purpose. Now the vessel can break, and what it held can disperse to whatever destination awaits such things. He looked at each of them in turn, his gaze clear and present in a way it hadn't been for weeks. Thank you, all of you, for caring for an old man whose existence defied explanation, for documenting what couldn't be easily believed, for bearing witness to the witnesses I carried. The journal will tell the stories, but you can tell the truth of how much it cost to preserve them. Caesar Bowen lived for 7 more days after that night. They were days of gradual peaceful decline, so different from the crisis that had preceded them that Dr. Sutton noted in his records. It's as if he's already died in some essential way, and now the body is simply completing the formality required for final departure. Dr. Sutton remained at the cabin almost constantly during this period, unwilling to leave Caesar alone. Fletcher continued his work with the journals, but spent hours each day sitting with the old man, sometimes talking, sometimes in companionable silence. Martha Hewitt brought meals and maintained the cabin with quiet efficiency. Samuel Pritchard stopped by daily to check if anything was needed. Caesar slept more and more, but when he was awake, he was remarkably lucid. He spoke about his life with a clarity that suggested the fragmentation had truly ended, that he had returned to being solely himself. I was born in February, he told them one afternoon. I remember being cold, always cold that first winter. My mother wrapped me in whatever scraps of cloth she could find, but it was never enough. She sang to me, though, old songs that her mother had taught her, songs that came from a place she'd never seen, but somehow remembered. I think that's when it started really, that understanding that memory could transcend individual experience, that the past could be carried forward in ways that exceeded rational explanation. He spoke about the woman who had performed the ritual, describing her more fully than he ever had before. Her name was Amarachi. It meant God's grace in her language, though she'd received little grace in her life. She'd been brought over on the ships as a young woman, survived the Middle Passage, survived the breaking of spirit that was meant to turn people into property. She retained something, though, knowledge, power, call it what you will. She recognized something in me, some capacity to hold more than I should have been able to hold. So she chose me for this burden, this blessing, this terrible gift of extended witness. Over those final days, Caesar also spoke about specific people whose memories he'd carried, describing them with such detail and affection that they became real to his listeners. Lydia, who had lost her children but maintained her dignity. Joshua, who had taught himself to read despite the severe punishment such knowledge invited. Sarah, who had chosen death over continued bondage, a choice Caesar described as the final assertion of autonomy in a system designed to strip all autonomy away. I've thought often about the morality of what happened to me, Caesar said on May 13th, his voice barely above a whisper. Now was it right for Amarachi to make me a vessel without my consent? I was a child. I had no say in the matter, but then I consider the alternative, hundreds of stories lost forever, hundreds of lives erased as if they'd never existed, which is the greater wrong, to burden one person with the weight of many, or to allow suffering to pass unrecorded, unacknowledged, unremembered. Dr. Sutton, who had been checking Caesar's pulse, looked up. What do you believe is the answer? I believe, Caesar said slowly, that the question itself is the answer. The fact that we can ask it, that we struggle with it, that we recognize the moral complexity, that's what matters. Slavery tried to reduce human beings to property, to things without moral significance. By preserving these stories, by insisting on their importance, by bearing witness to the humanity of people, the system tried to erase. That was resistance. That was victory, even in the midst of profound loss. On May 14th, Caesar asked to be moved outside. It was a warm spring day, unusual for Ohio in mid-May, and the sky was clear and blue. They carried him, chair and all, and set him up under an old oak tree whose branches had probably provided shade for 50 years or more. Caesar sat there for hours, his face turned toward the sun, occasionally speaking, but mostly just breathing in the air, watching the clouds drift past, listening to the birds. At one point he said, "I had forgotten how beautiful the world could be when you weren't carrying the weight of so much sorrow. It's extraordinary. Every leaf, every blade of grass, every shift in the light, it's all so precious." That evening they moved him back inside. He was growing weaker now, eating almost nothing, sleeping more than he was awake. But when he did wake, he was peaceful, present himself. On the morning of May 15th, Caesar woke early. Dr. Sutton, who had been dozing in a chair nearby, was alerted by the sound of Caesar's voice. "Doctor," the old man said softly, "I want to thank you for everything you've done. For believing me when you had every reason not to. For documenting what you witnessed, even though it defied your understanding, for treating me as a person rather than a curiosity. It's been my privilege," Dr. Sutton said, and meant it. Journals, Caesar continued, "promise me they'll be preserved. Promise me that historians will have access to them, the stories they contain. They're all that remains of so many people. They deserve to be known." "I promise, Doctor," Sutton said solemnly. Caesar nodded satisfied. "Good, that's good." He closed his eyes, seeming to gather his strength. When he opened them again, he looked directly at the doctor. "I'm ready now. I can feel it approaching, and I'm not afraid. I've lived long enough. I've seen enough. I've carried the burden I was meant to carry, and now I can lay it down. Is there anything you need, Doctor?" Sutton asked. "Anything I can do to make you more comfortable?" "Just stay," Caesar whispered. "Don't let me die alone. That's all anyone can ask, really. Not to be alone at the end." "I'll stay, Doctor," Sutton promised. Fletcher arrived mid-morning, having sensed somehow that this would be the final day. He brought fresh flowers from Martha Hewitt's garden, which they placed in a jar by Caesar's bedside. The old man smiled when he saw them, a small but genuine expression of pleasure. "Lilacs," he murmured. "Haven't seen lilacs in years. My mother told me they grew in the gardens of the big house, but we never got close enough to see them properly. Now here they are, brought to me like an offering." World is strange and sometimes kind. As the day progressed, Caesar drifted in and out of consciousness. When he was awake, he spoke occasionally, sometimes clearly, sometimes in fragments that made sense only to him. He mentioned names they recognized from the journals. He hummed snatches of songs. He smiled at private memories. Around 2:00 in the afternoon, he opened his eyes and looked at Dr. Sutton with sudden clarity. "Thank you for bearing witness to my witness. Make sure the journals survive. Make sure the stories are told. Make sure people know that we were here, that we mattered, that our suffering and our resistance and our humanity were real and significant and worthy of remembrance." "I will, Doctor," Sutton said, his throat tight. "I promise you, Caesar, your witness will not be forgotten." Caesar smiled, a peaceful expression that transformed his weathered face. "That's all I needed to hear. That's enough." Then he closed his eyes for the final time, his breathing grew shallower, slower, the intervals between breaths lengthening. Dr. Sutton held his hand, monitoring his pulse, watching the gradual cessation of life with the clinical part of his mind. Even as the human part grieved, at 2:47 p.m., Caesar Bowen took his last breath. It was gentle, undramatic, simply a breath that was not followed by another. Dr. Sutton waited, checking for a pulse, finding none. He placed a hand over Caesar's chest, feeling for a heartbeat. Nothing. The body remained warm, peaceful, the expression on the old man's face serene. "He's gone, Doctor," Sutton said quietly. Fletcher, who had been sitting in the corner, came forward to stand beside the bed. The two men remained there for several minutes, neither speaking, both feeling the weight of what they'd witnessed. Finally, Dr. Sutton closed Caesar's eyes and pulled the sheet up over his face. "I'll notify the coroner," Fletcher said, "and I'll send word to Martha and Samuel." The county coroner, Dr. William Hayes, arrived within the hour. He was a practical man, thorough in his examinations, skeptical of anything that couldn't be measured or verified. He examined Caesar's body with professional detachment, making notes, taking measurements. When he finished, he looked at Dr. Sutton with an expression that suggested deep discomfort. "I've been a physician for 32 years, he said. "I've examined hundreds of bodies. I don't have adequate terms for what I'm observing." "What did you find?" Dr. Sutton asked. Hayes consulted his notes. "The bone structure is completely unlike anything I've seen in someone who died at a typical elderly age. The density is wrong, the wear patterns are wrong, the degree of deterioration is wrong. The teeth show usage patterns that would require decades beyond normal lifespan. The skin, what remains of it, exhibits aging characteristics that exceed any documented case in medical literature. The internal organs," he paused, shaking his head, "they appear to have functioned far beyond their expected capacity." "Can you confirm the documented age?" Fletcher asked. "Can you say definitively that he was 126 years old?" "I cannot confirm it through physical examination alone," Hayes admitted, "but neither can I rule it out. Every physical indicator suggests extreme age far exceeding normal human parameters. If someone told me this body was 150 years old, I couldn't contradict them based on the evidence. It's impossible, but it's what the evidence suggests." He wrote his official report that evening, choosing his words carefully. "Subject appears to be of extremely advanced age, though exact determination is difficult due to unusual tissue degradation patterns. Bone structure suggests lifespan significantly exceeding normal human parameters. Dental wear consistent with extremely prolonged use. No obvious cause of death beyond systemic failure associated with extreme aging. The documented age of 126 years cannot be confirmed through physical examination alone, but neither can it be ruled out based on the observed evidence. This case presents questions that exceed current medical understanding. Caesar was buried 2 days later in the Woodland Cemetery in Xenia in a plot that Dr. Sutton purchased with his own funds. The funeral was attended by perhaps 30 people: Dr. Sutton, Fletcher, Martha Hewitt, Samuel Pritchard, several other neighbors, and a surprising number of elderly African Americans from surrounding communities who had heard of Caesar's death and came to pay their respects. One old woman, who must have been 80 herself, told Dr. Sutton, "My grandmother spoke of Caesar, said he was old when she was young, said he remembered things no living person should remember, said he carried the stories so we wouldn't forget. We won't forget the gravestone. Simple but dignified reads Caesar Bowen, 1762, 1888. He remembered the 63 journals were carefully packed and transported to Dr. Sutton's home, where he built a special case to store them safely. He spent the remaining 15 years of his life studying them, cross-referencing every verifiable claim, tracking down descendants of people mentioned in the entries, visiting locations described in pages. The more he researched, the more convinced he became that Caesar had been telling the truth. Every specific detail that could be checked proved accurate. People Caesar claimed to have met had existed, events he described had occurred, places he depicted matched historical records. In 1895, Dr. Sutton published his book, The Extended Witness, a medical and historical examination of extreme longevity. It was a comprehensive analysis of Caesar's case, including extensive excerpts from the journal's medical documentation, coroner's reports, and verification of historical claims. The book presented Caesar's story alongside careful scientific analysis, acknowledging what could be proven and honestly admitting what remained mysterious. The book was not well received by the scientific community. Critics argued that Dr. Sutton had been deceived by an elaborate fraud, that the journals were likely written by multiple people over many years and falsely attributed to one man, that the historical verifications were coincidental or the result of Caesar having access to historical documents, that the medical evidence was misinterpreted or exaggerated. The Journal of the American Medical Association published a scathing review. Dr. Sutton's work, while thorough in its documentation, relies on the impossible premise that a human being lived to be 126 years old, and more incredibly, that this individual somehow absorbed memories of others. Such claims have no basis in biological fact and represent a dangerous deviation from scientific rigor. We must assume that Dr. Sutton, despite his previously solid reputation, has been led astray by emotional attachment to his subject and has allowed sentiment to override rational judgment. But Dr. Sutton never wavered in his conclusions. He responded to his critics calmly, presenting additional documentation, inviting skeptics to examine the journals themselves, offering to fund independent verification of his research. Few took him up on the offer. It was easier to dismiss the case entirely than to engage with evidence that challenged fundamental assumptions about human biology and consciousness. In the final entry of his own journal, written shortly before his death in 1903, Dr. Sutton wrote, "I cannot prove scientifically how Caesar Bowen lived for 126 years. I cannot explain through known biological mechanisms how one man could accumulate and retain such an extraordinary span of memories. I cannot demonstrate through reproducible experimentation how consciousness might transcend individual embodiment or how memory might be transferred between people. But I know what I witnessed. I know the documentary evidence. I know the historical verifications. I know the testimony of others who encountered Caesar over many decades, and I believe that in seeking to understand Caesar, we must be willing to consider that consciousness, memory, and human experience are far more complex and mysterious than our current science acknowledges. Perhaps future generations with more advanced understanding will be able to explain what I can only document. Until then, I stand by my witness of Caesar's witness, and I trust that truth, however strange, will eventually be recognized. As such, the journals themselves were eventually donated to the Ohio Historical Society in 1904 following Dr. Sutton's death. They remained largely unstudied for decades, filed away in archives as curiosities occasionally examined by researchers, but never fully appreciated for what they represented. It wasn't until the 1960s, during the Civil Rights Movement, that renewed interest in slave narratives brought Caesar's journals back to light. Historians who examined them with fresh perspectives began to appreciate their extraordinary value as primary source documents. They verified dozens of specific claims, names, dates, events, locations that Caesar could not have known through normal means unless he had actually been present or had direct contact with primary sources that no longer existed. Dr. Patricia Morrison, a historian who spent 5 years studying the journals in the 1970s, wrote, "Whether Caesar Bowen actually lived for 126 years is perhaps less important than what his journals represent. The most comprehensive first-person account of African-American slave experience across multiple states, multiple decades, and multiple aspects of the institution. The consistency of detail, the emotional authenticity, the historical accuracy of verifiable claims. These make the journals invaluable regardless of how we explain their origin. If Caesar's claims about absorbing others' memories are true, then he succeeded in preserving testimonies that would otherwise have been lost. If the journals were somehow compiled from multiple sources, but attributed to one person, then someone went to extraordinary lengths to preserve these stories. Either way, the value of the content is undeniable. Modern DNA analysis of hair samples preserved in Dr. Sutton's collection has provided some interesting data, though nothing conclusive. The Mere length in the samples suggests extreme cellular age beyond what would typically be expected. But scientists caution that sample degradation over time makes definitive conclusions impossible. The question of how Caesar Bowen lived to be 126 years old remains officially unanswered. The question of whether he truly carried the memories and experiences of others has no scientific consensus. Parapsychologists have cited his case as evidence for collective consciousness or memory transfer. Skeptics maintain it was an elaborate hoax or a case of extreme confabulation. Religious scholars have interpreted it as divine intervention or spiritual testimony. Neuroscientists acknowledge that we still don't fully understand memory consolidation, consciousness, or the full capabilities of the human brain, leaving room for phenomena we can't yet explain. What is certain is that Caesar Bowen existed. Birth records, sale documents, manumission papers, census records, property deeds, and finally death certificates all attest to a man who lived in Greene County, Ohio for over 60 years and claimed to have been born during the reign of King George Roman III. What is certain is that he left behind 63 journals containing detailed testimonies from the slave experience. What is certain is that multiple physicians, coroners, and witnesses documented his extreme age and unusual physical condition. What is certain is that he dedicated his final years to ensuring that suffering would be remembered and resistance would be honored. In Greene County, Ohio, elderly residents still sometimes speak of the old man who remembered everything, who carried the weight of his people's suffering, who witnessed the birth of a nation and eventual death of the institution that had enslaved him. They speak of him with a mixture of awe and unease, as if acknowledging that some mysteries exceed our capacity for explanation, as if recognizing that in our rush to understand everything rationally, we sometimes miss truths that operate on different frequencies. Caesar's cabin stood for another 40 years after his death, gradually falling into ruin. Locals reported odd phenomena, unexplained sounds, unexplained cold spots, a feeling of presence that visitors couldn't quite define. In 1928, when the structure was finally demolished, workers claimed they heard singing as the walls came down. Old songs in unknown languages that faded as the last boards were pulled away. The land where the cabin stood remained empty for decades. Neighbors said nothing would grow there properly. Plants withered, grass yellowed, even weeds struggled. In 1965, the site was paved over for a parking lot, and whatever presence lingered, there was buried beneath asphalt and forgotten by most. But the journals remain. They sit in climate-controlled archives available to researchers, students, anyone who wants to engage with the testimony of a man who claimed to have lived longer than should be possible, who claimed to carry memories that weren't entirely his own, who dedicated his impossible life to ensuring that suffering and survival would not be forgotten. Whether Caesar Bowen actually lived for 126 years, whether he truly absorbed the memories of others through some mechanism we don't understand, whether Amarach's ritual actually altered his relationship with time and consciousness, these questions may never be answered with certainty. Science may eventually develop frameworks for understanding phenomena that currently seem impossible, or the mystery may remain forever unresolved, a testament to the limits of human knowledge. But perhaps the more important question is not how he lived so long, but what he chose to do with that extended existence. He could have used it for personal gain, for revenge against those who had enslaved him for any number of purposes. Instead, he chose to remember, to record, to bear witness. He chose to make his impossible life a repository for stories that would otherwise have died with their tellers. He chose to honor people who history would have otherwise erased entirely. In the end, perhaps that is the real mystery and the real legacy of Caesar Bowen. Not the impossible span of his years, but the depth of his commitment to honoring the lives of people who history would have otherwise forgotten. His story challenges us to consider what we choose to remember, whose testimonies we value, and whether we are willing to acknowledge that some forms of truth transcend the boundaries of conventional proof. It challenges us to wonder whether consciousness and memory might operate in ways we haven't yet discovered. Whether the boundary between individuals might be more permeable than we assume. Whether suffering and testimony might leave imprints that persist beyond individual bodies and brains. And it reminds us that the greatest mysteries are often not about the supernatural or the fantastical, but about the depths of human experience, the resilience of the human spirit, and the lengths to which people will go to ensure that truth survives, that suffering is acknowledged, and that the dead are not forgotten. This mystery shows us that sometimes the most powerful legacy is not wealth or fame or power, but simply the commitment to bearing witness, to remembering, to ensuring that lives lived in darkness are finally brought to light. What do you think of this story? Do you believe it was possible for one man to live so long? Or was there a more rational explanation we've yet to discover? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe to the Circle of Fear 1, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. See you in the next video.